The year is 2005. A deep, chilling silence hangs over Black Creek, West Virginia, a silence that has seeped from the earth itself for half a century. Below the town, the Widow's Shaft mine lies dormant, a labyrinth of forgotten tunnels and buried memories. Its entrance, a gaping wound in the mountainside, is about to be sealed forever, erasing a chapter of local history written in coal dust and sacrifice. For 50 years the mine has held its secrets tightly, its darkness absolute, and its stories untold. But some secrets are not meant to stay buried. They wait patiently in the cold and the dark, clinging to forgotten objects, for the faintest flicker of light to bring them back into the world, ready to shatter the quiet peace built upon their absence. A small team of engineers, their faces illuminated by the harsh glare of headlamps, descends into the abyss. Their mission is purely procedural, a final structural assessment before the permanent seal is poured. The air is thick, with the smell of damp stone and a metallic tang of decay, a scent that clings to the back of the throat. Their heavy boots crunch on loose gravel, the sound echoing unnaturally in the oppressive stillness. They're men of science and pragmatism, their minds focused on stress fractures and geological stability, not on the ghosts of the men who once toiled here. They move with a detached efficiency, their powerful flashlights cutting sharp, sterile beams through a darkness that feels ancient and alive. Deeper they go, following a maze of tunnels that branch off into nothingness. They check support beams, tap on rock walls, their voices low and professional as they call out measurements and observations. This is a tomb, and they are its final undertakers. The maps they carry are old, brittle documents from 1955, the year the mine was shuttered after a catastrophic collapse. According to the official records, this final inspection should be straightforward, but maps, like history, often omit the most critical details. They chart a course but cannot prepare you for what you might find when you stray from the designated path, drawn by a draft of air from a place that isn't supposed to exist. It is a faint whisper of air that leads them astray. One of the younger engineers, lagging slightly behind, feels it on his cheek, a cold current from a fissure in the rock face, barely visible behind a pile of rubble. Curiosity, a dangerous impulse in a place like this, takes hold. With the help of his partner, he pries away loose rocks, revealing a narrow, unmapped passage. It is a forgotten gallery, not on any blueprint, sealed off by a rockslide long ago. A collective breath is held as they shine their lights into the opening. The beam illuminates a small, caved-in chamber, a time capsule of despair, untouched by human hands for 5 decades. Inside the chamber, time has stood still. Rusted tools lie where they were dropped, a pickaxe leaning against a wall as if its owner had just stepped away for a moment. But it's not the tools that draw their eyes. In the center of the small space, half buried in debris, sits a small, rusted bird cage. It's a canary cage, a common piece of equipment from the era, used to detect toxic gases. Its delicate wires are corroded, its door hanging ajar. The object is so out of place, so poignantly fragile in the immense, crushing weight of the mountain, that it seems to radiate a story of its own, a silent testament to a final, unheard warning. The lead engineer approaches cautiously, his flashlight beam fixed on the cage. As he gets closer, he sees it. Lying on the floor of the cage are the minuscule, perfectly preserved bones of a canary, a tiny skeleton, its delicate rib cage and fragile skull, a haunting miniature of death. The men fall silent, the professional detachment of their mission momentarily fractured by this small, intimate tragedy. The bird's sacrifice was its purpose, a life given to save others. But here, in this sealed-off tomb, it's clear that both the warning and the warner were lost together, their final moments swallowed by the same indifferent darkness that now surrounded them. Then, something catches the light, a glint of metal, not the dull brown of rust, but a faint, silvery shine. Tied to the canary's tiny leg bone with a preserved strand of twine is a small, cylindrical object. It's a metal capsule, no bigger than a man's fingertip, the kind used to carry messages. Its surface is tarnished but intact, its purpose unmistakable. It was not a part of the cage or a piece of mining equipment. It was placed there deliberately, a final, desperate act of communication. The atmosphere in the chamber shifts from one of historical curiosity to one of profound, chilling discovery. This was not just a relic, it was a message from the grave. With trembling, gloved fingers, the engineer carefully unties the capsule from the delicate bone. It feels cold and heavy in his palm, a weight far greater than its physical size. The men gather closer, their headlamps creating a tight circle of intense light, pushing back the immense darkness for a few precious feet. The silence is now electric with anticipation. Slowly, methodically, the engineer unscrews the cap. The threads resist at first, sealed by time and corrosion, but then give way with a faint grating sound. He tips the capsule, and a tiny, tightly rolled piece of yellowed paper falls into his hand. It is a note. The paper is fragile, its edges darkened with age and moisture, but the ink, a faded blue, is still legible. He carefully unrolls it, his breath held, his colleagues peering over his shoulder. The cramped, hurried handwriting speaks of a time long past, of a voice silenced decades ago. 50 years of silence, 50 years of a story officially closed, 50 years of a town's quiet acceptance of a tragedy. All of it was about to be undone by a few words, written in a desperate race against time by a man buried alive. The engineers stand frozen in the forgotten gallery, staring at the message from the past. What final, terrible truth did it hold? The phone rang at 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday, a shrill interruption to the quiet hum of Claire Miller's Chicago apartment. On the other end of the line, a man's voice, hesitant and tinged with a thick Appalachian accent she hadn't heard in years, introduced himself as an engineer from West Virginia. He spoke of a routine inspection of a mine called the Widow's Shaft, a name that was more myth than memory to her. He mentioned a forgotten passage, a rusted birdcage, and a tiny skeleton. Claire listened with polite, detached interest, her mind still half occupied by the historical manuscript she was editing. But then the man said something that made the air in the room feel thin and cold, a single phrase that stopped her world from turning. "We found a note, ma'am. It has your grandfather's name on it." The name, Samuel Jones, landed with the force of a physical blow. It was a name that belonged to faded photographs on her grandmother's mantelpiece, a name whispered with a mixture of pride and sorrow throughout her entire life. The engineer, sensing the shift in the atmosphere over the phone line, continued with a clinical precision that did nothing to soften the impact. He described the metal capsule, the way it was tied to the canary's leg bone, a final, desperate message in a bottle, cast into an ocean of earth and time. For 50 years, her grandfather had been a ghost, a family legend swallowed by the mountain. Now, in the space of a single phone call, he was becoming something terrifyingly real, something tangible, that had left behind a final, undiscovered piece of himself. A wave of dizziness washed over Claire. She gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles turning white, as she tried to process the impossible reality of the engineer's words. Her grandfather wasn't just a story told to her by her grandmother, a heroic Union man who vanished in a tragic accident. He was a man who had fought for his last breath, a man who had taken the time, in his final moments, to write something down. The abstract grief her family had carried for 2 generations suddenly had a focal point, a specific scene she could now visualize with horrifying clarity. Sam Jones, alone in the suffocating darkness, composing a final testament while the weight of the mountain pressed in around him, knowing he would never see the sun again. Her mind was a chaotic slideshow of inherited memories. The black-and-white photo of Sam, his arm around her grandmother, their smiles radiating a hope that felt almost cruel in hindsight. Another of him holding her mother, then just an infant, with a look of profound paternal love for a child he would never know. These weren't just historical artifacts anymore. They were pieces of a life deliberately stolen. The official story, the one the Blackstone Mining Company had cemented into the town's history, had always been one of two possibilities: a tragic, unavoidable collapse, or the cowardly desertion of a leader who abandoned his men. Her grandmother never believed it, and now Claire knew why. The truth had been waiting, preserved in a tiny metal tomb. Then the engineer read the note aloud. His voice was steady, but Claire could hear the tremor beneath it. Bishop sabotaged the supports. He left me trapped. Tell my wife I love her. The fight must go on. Asterisk. The words sliced through 50 years of carefully constructed lies, each one a hammer blow against the official record. Nup Summers. Left me trapped. It wasn't an accident. It was a murder. The confirmation of a dark suspicion her family had harbored in secret for decades echoed in the sudden, deafening silence of her apartment. The story wasn't about a man who was lost. It was about a man who was executed, buried alive by a colleague, for reasons she couldn't yet fathom but knew she had to uncover. After the call ended, Claire stood motionless, the receiver still pressed against her ear as if she could somehow pull more information from the dial tone. The world outside her window, the distant traffic, the faint laughter from a nearby park, felt alien and intrusive. Her reality had been fundamentally altered. The quiet, academic life she had built for herself, a life spent studying the past of strangers, had just violently collided with her own. The personal and the professional had fused into a singular, urgent mission. Her grandfather's last words weren't just a farewell. They were an assignment, a torch passed to her through a half-century of darkness, and its flame was the truth. Her first thought was her grandmother, Eleanor, now frail and living in a quiet nursing home. Her memories of that day in 1955 still as sharp as broken glass. A fierce, protective instinct surged through Claire. How could she deliver this news? How could she tell this woman, who had waited 50 years for a body that never came, that her husband's final moments were spent in terror, betrayed by a man he worked alongside? The promise Claire had made to her countless times, "One day, Grandma, we'll find out what really happened," had always been a comforting fantasy. Now it was a solemn, terrifying duty she was obligated to fulfill, regardless of the pain it would inevitably cause. On her bookshelf, tucked between academic texts, was a small, leather-bound diary, Eleanor's diary, from 1955. Claire pulled it down, her hands trembling as she opened its delicate pages. Her grandmother's youthful, looping script filled the pages with details of the strike, her anxieties over Sam's safety, and her unwavering belief in his cause. "Sam says the fight is for our future, for a life where the company doesn't own our souls." One entry read. Claire realized with a chilling certainty that the note found in the mine was the final missing entry to this very diary, a direct, posthumous response to the hopes and fears her grandmother had poured onto these pages 50 years ago. But this was just the beginning of what was to come. Unearthing a note was a shocking discovery, but proving a 50-year-old murder orchestrated by a powerful corporation was an entirely different war. If you're finding this story as gripping as I am, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss a single step of this investigation. We want to hear from you, so tell us in the comments where you're watching from. What would you do in a situation like this? Do you think you could bear the weight of uncovering a family secret so devastatingly dark? The initial shock began to crystallize into a cold, hard resolve. Claire wasn't just a grieving granddaughter. She was a trained historian and an investigative journalist. Her entire career had been a preparation for this moment. She knew how to navigate archives, how to connect disparate facts, how to follow a trail of evidence no matter how cold it had become. This was no longer just about clearing her family's name. Sam's final message, "The fight must go on," transformed his personal tragedy into a broader battle for justice. It was for every family in Black Creek that had been broken by the company's greed, and for every truth that had been buried under the weight of corporate power. Her gaze fell upon the main photograph on her desk, Sam Jones, young, confident, his eyes burning with a conviction that seemed to transcend time. It felt as if he were looking directly at her, challenging her, trusting her. In that moment, a silent pact was formed between them across the abyss of 50 years. She would not let him down. She would not let his final, desperate act of communication be for nothing. Picking up her phone, her hands now steady, Claire booked the first flight to Charleston, West Virginia. The past was no longer a subject of study. It was a crime scene, and she was going to expose every secret it held. Black Creek, West Virginia, in 1955, was a town that belonged to the mountain, and the mountain belonged to the Blackstone Mining Company. Life was dictated by the shriek of the mine whistle, a sound that sliced through the morning fog and called husbands and sons to the gaping maw of the widow's shaft. The air itself tasted of coal, a fine, gritty dust that settled on windowsills, coated the lungs, and served as a constant reminder of the town's singular, suffocating purpose. This wasn't just a community. It was a cog in a vast, uncaring machine. The company owned the houses the miners lived in, the store where they bought their food, and, most believed, the very souls of the men who descended into the earth each day, trading their health and years for a wage that was never quite enough. In the midst of this oppressive landscape walked Samuel Sam Jones, a man who seemed to carry his own source of light. At 28, he was more than just another miner. He was the town's conscience, with a voice that could command attention without ever raising to a shout, and eyes that held an unwavering fire of conviction. Sam was a natural leader. He spoke of dignity, of safety, of a future where a man's life was worth more than the coal he could extract. To the exhausted, soot-covered men who gathered to hear him speak after their shifts, he was a prophet. To the mine's management, sequestered in their clean offices on the hill, he was a dangerous agitator, a spark that threatened to ignite a wildfire of rebellion and disrupt the profitable order of things. Sam's strength was anchored in his small, clapboard house on the edge of town, where his wife, Eleanor, created a sanctuary from the coal dust and the conflict. Their love was a quiet, profound force, a partnership built on shared dreams and mutual respect. Eleanor, with her steady hands and calming presence, understood the risks her husband was taking. She saw the exhaustion behind his determined smile and felt the weight of his responsibility in the tense set of his shoulders. Their infant daughter, Sarah, was the living embodiment of the future they were fighting for, a future where she wouldn't have to fear the sound of the mine whistle or wonder if her father would return from the darkness below. Eleanor chronicled her hopes and fears in a small leather diary, a private testament to the personal cost of a public battle. The primary obstacle to Sam's vision was Arthur Bishop, the mine foreman. A man who had risen from the ranks, Bishop had traded the solidarity of the tunnels for the authority of the company. He was a product of Black Creek, yet he saw the town and its people through the cold lens of productivity and profit. He viewed Sam's unionizing efforts not as a righteous cause, but as a foolish, sentimental crusade that threatened the delicate balance he maintained between the workers and the company executives. The tension between the two men was a palpable thing, a low hum of animosity in the cramped mine elevators and a sharp edge in their brief, clipped conversations. Bishop saw Sam's idealism as a direct threat to his own hard-won position, a challenge that had to be neutralized. The conflict was rapidly approaching its breaking point. For months, whispers of a strike had grown into a roar. A series of preventable accidents, culminating in a near-fatal roof collapse that the company dismissed as minor negligence, had galvanized the workforce. Sam had expertly channeled their fear and anger into organized action. Secret meetings were held in basements and church halls, where men who had been silent for years finally found their voice. The town was a powder keg, with families divided and loyalties tested. Every miner had to make a choice. Stand with Sam for a chance at a better life, or bow to the company and endure the familiar hardship, praying they weren't the next victim of a faulty support beam or a pocket of methane gas. The widow's shaft itself was a place of legend and dread, a labyrinthine wound in the earth that had claimed countless lives over the decades. Its very name was a testament to the town's long history of loss. Inside, it was a world of perpetual twilight, where the only light came from the lamps on the miners' helmets, cutting feeble paths through the oppressive, damp dark. The air was cold and smelled of wet rock and explosive powder. It was a place where the constant groaning of the mountains served as a reminder of the thousands of tons of rock suspended precariously above. For the men of Black Creek, this was their office, their battlefield, and, for too many, their tomb. It was against this backdrop of inherent danger that they prepared to fight for their basic human rights. The night before the planned strike, the tension in Sam and Eleanor's small house was thick enough to touch. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands, calloused and stained with coal dust, wrapped around a mug of coffee. He spoke to her not of victory or defeat, but of necessity. "This isn't just about us, Elle," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's so Sarah never has to know this fear." Eleanor watched him, her heart a tangled knot of pride and terror. She knew he was right, but the fear of what the company, and men like Arthur Bishop, might do, was a cold presence in the room. Later that night she wrote in her diary, "He is fighting for the light, but I am so afraid he will be swallowed by the darkness." On the morning of the strike, a cold, gray dawn broke over Black Creek. A profound silence hung in the air, the familiar 6 a.m. mine whistle conspicuously absent. Instead, hundreds of men gathered at the mine entrance, their faces pale in the early light, their expressions a mixture of defiance and apprehension. Sam stood on the bed of a pickup truck, addressing the crowd. His words were not of anger, but of hope and solidarity, his voice echoing against the mountainside. Across the yard, standing near the foreman's office, Arthur Bishop watched the scene unfold. His face was a mask of cold composure, betraying nothing of the plan that was already in motion. The lines had been drawn. The fight for Black Creek's soul had begun. The town of Black Creek was a chessboard, and Arthur Bishop had spent years mastering the game. As foreman, he was the king's most powerful piece, positioned precariously between the untouchable executives on the hill and the expendable pawns in the tunnels below. He had clawed his way to this position, sacrificing friendships and callousing his conscience with every step. In Sam Jones, he saw not a hero but a reckless player about to upend the entire board. Bishop believed in order, the brutal, predictable order imposed by the company. He saw Sam's talk of unions and rights as a fantasy that would lead only to starvation and ruin when the company inevitably crushed the rebellion. To Bishop, removing Sam wasn't just an act of self-preservation, it was a grim, necessary move to protect the town from its own foolish idealism, a cruel calculus he had long since accepted as the price of survival in the shadow of the mountain. This division of loyalty cut through the heart of the community, turning neighbors into strangers. While many saw Sam as their salvation, others whispered that he was a fool, a troublemaker risking their meager livelihoods for an impossible dream. These were the men with too many children to feed, with debts at the company store that felt like a physical chain around their necks. They saw the cold, hard reality that Blackstone Mining owned everything: their homes, their credit, their future. A failed strike wouldn't just mean losing a job. It would mean eviction, blacklisting, and being cast out with nowhere to go. This palpable fear created a silent, resentful faction that watched Sam's rise with deep anxiety, their silent prayers for his failure, a stark counterpoint to the hopeful chorus of his supporters. The conflict wasn't just man against company, it was man against man, hope against fear. The Blackstone Mining Company's control was absolute, a form of modern-day feudalism cloaked in the guise of employment. Their power was woven into the very fabric of daily life, extending far beyond the mine entrance. They issued scrip, a private currency redeemable only at the overpriced company store, ensuring that a significant portion of every miner's wage flowed directly back into their coffers. They funded the town's only school, shaping the curriculum to emphasize obedience and the nobility of labor. They even paid a portion of the preacher's salary, guaranteeing that Sunday sermons often spoke more of patience and earthly suffering than of justice and righteous anger. This web of dependency was by design, creating a populace that was hesitant to challenge a system that, while exploitative, was also the sole provider of their existence. To fight the company was to fight the world, as they knew it. The push for a strike was born from more than just low wages. It was a desperate plea for survival. The widow's shaft was notorious for its disregard for safety, a reputation earned in blood and broken bodies. Miners spoke in hushed tones of the widowmakers, support beams made from green, unseasoned timber that would crack and splinter under the immense pressure of the earth. Ventilation was a luxury, and the air was thick with a toxic cocktail of coal and silica dust, a guaranteed sentence to a slow, agonizing death from black lung. The canaries carried into the depths were often the only early warning system against deadly pockets of methane gas. Sam's fight wasn't for wealth. It was for the fundamental right to return home to his family at the end of a shift, a right the company treated as a negotiable expense on a balance sheet. Eleanor Jones was the quiet heart of the revolution, her strength a steady, unwavering flame in the face of the encroaching darkness. Their small home became the unofficial headquarters of the union movement, the kitchen table, a battlefield where strategies were drawn, and spirits were bolstered with coffee and conviction. While Sam was the voice, Eleanor was the scribe, the organizer, the keeper of the flame. Her leather-bound diary was more than a collection of personal anxieties. It was a meticulous record of the struggle. She documented every meeting, every threat from the company, every family that pledged their support. She was creating a historical record, driven by an instinct that this fight was too important to be left to memory alone. She was the first historian of their cause, unknowingly preserving the evidence that her granddaughter would one day need to unearth the truth of her sacrifice. Among the faces in the crowd who looked to Sam with a mixture of awe and trepidation was a young Caleb Hayes. Barely 20, with a wife and a newborn at home, Caleb was caught in the crossfire of his own convictions. He believed in Sam's cause with every fiber of his being, but the fear of company retaliation was a cold knot in his stomach. He remembered a quiet conversation with Sam a week before the strike, confessing his terror. Sam had placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, his gaze steady and kind. "Courage isn't about not being afraid, Caleb," he had said. "It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified." Those words had bolstered Caleb's resolve, but they would also become the source of his deepest shame, haunting him for 50 years as he held onto a secret that proved his fear had ultimately been stronger than his courage. The mechanism for the crime was hidden in plain sight, a routine part of the mine's daily operation. Controlled detonations were a common practice, the thunderous blasts of dynamite used to break through stubborn rock faces and open new veins of coal. It was a dangerous but necessary procedure, and its familiarity provided the perfect camouflage for murder. A scheduled blast in an isolated, structurally questionable gallery would raise no immediate alarms. Only a few men would be assigned to such a task, making it easy to isolate a target. All it would take was a deliberately oversized charge, a tampered fuse, or the accidental removal of a key support beam moments before the explosion. For a man like Arthur Bishop, who knew the mine's labyrinthine passages and operational protocols intimately, orchestrating such an accident would be a simple, brutally efficient matter of logistics. On the final night of Black Creek's old life, an electric tension settled over the valley, thick and heavy as the evening fog. It was a night of quiet rituals and unspoken fears. Across town, men sharpened the points of their pickaxes and cleaned the coal dust from their tools, wondering if they were preparing for a strike or for another day in the suffocating darkness of the shaft. Wives held their husbands a little tighter, their silent prayers a desperate plea for safety in the uncertain days ahead. In their small house, Sam Jones stood by the window, watching the distant, skeletal silhouette of the mine's headframe against the darkening sky. He was not just looking at a structure of wood and steel. He was facing his Goliath. And in the oppressive silence of that night, the entire town seemed to hold its breath, sensing that the dawn would bring not just a new day, but a reckoning. Claire Miller's rental car kicked up a cloud of reddish dust as she pulled into Black Creek, a town that seemed preserved in amber. The mountains, ancient and imposing, pressed in on all sides, casting long shadows that felt like memories. It was a place where the past wasn't just remembered. It was an active, breathing presence in the rusted mine headframes and the weary faces of the old-timers sitting on their porches. In her passenger seat, secured in a protective case, was the rusted birdcage. It was smaller than she'd imagined, a fragile, skeletal thing. She reached out and touched its cold metal bars, the physical reality of the object sending a tremor through her. This cage was her compass now, the one tangible link back to a man she'd only ever known through faded photographs and whispered stories. It was the beginning of the trail, the first piece of a puzzle she had to solve before the last person who remembered its shape was gone forever. Her first move was not driven by emotion, but by cold, hard strategy. She knew the Blackstone Mining Company, the corporate successor to the entity that had ruled this town, would attack the note's credibility with an army of lawyers. Before she could confront a single person, she needed to make the note's authenticity unshakable. From her motel room, a place that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and pine cleaner, she made a call to Dr. Evelyn Reed, a forensic document examiner in Philadelphia, whose reputation was legendary. Claire explained the situation with the precision of a historian laying out a thesis, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. Dr. Reed agreed to see the evidence. With painstaking care, Claire packaged the tiny yellowed scroll and the metal capsule, placing them in a climate-controlled container. She was shipping her family's entire history, a 50-year-old cry for help, across state lines, trusting science to be its first and most important witness. While the note was en route to Philadelphia, Claire descended into a different kind of darkness, the town's archives, housed in the musty basement of the public library. Surrounded by the scent of decaying paper and silverfish, she spent hours hunched over a clunky microfilm reader, scrolling through the 1955 editions of the Black Creek Chronicle. The official narrative of the collapse was presented in stark, emotionless print. Articles praised the company for its swift response and generous, but meager, compensation to the families. One editorial even subtly suggested that union agitators, like Sam Jones, had created an unstable environment, implying his disappearance might have been a deliberate act of desertion. Claire felt a cold fury building in her chest. She was reading the carefully constructed lies that had buried her grandfather a second time, a tomb of ink and paper built on top of his tomb of rock and earth. That night, back in the sterile quiet of her motel room, the official lies from the newspaper echoed in her mind. She needed an anchor, a voice of truth to cling to. She opened Eleanor's leather diary, its pages as fragile as a butterfly's wings. Her grandmother's elegant script provided the immediate antidote to the company's propaganda. She found the entry from the day after the collapse, dated October 12, 1955. Arthur Bishop came to the door with the company men. Eleanor had written. He said there was nothing they could do, that the gallery was too unstable. But he wouldn't look me in the eye. He just stared at the floorboards, his face pale as a ghost. He knows something. I can feel it. They are all lying, and that man, Bishop, is the keeper of their secrets. The name, written in faded blue ink 50 years ago, seemed to leap off the page, a direct accusation from the past. The call from Dr. Reed came 3 days later. Claire's hand trembled as she answered. The expert's voice was calm, methodical, and utterly devoid of drama, which made her words all the more powerful. The paper's chemical composition is a perfect match for pulp paper produced between 1950 and 1956, Dr. Reed began, her tone clinical. The ink shows oxidation patterns consistent with a 50-year timeline and contains iron gall, common in fountain pen inks of that specific era. Furthermore, the metal capsule shows no signs of modern tampering. Its corrosion is uniform and deep, a slow process that could only have occurred over decades in a stable, humid environment. Claire closed her eyes, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. The foundation was solid. The note was real. Her grandfather's voice was authentic. But Dr. Reed wasn't finished. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that would transform the note from a historical artifact into a legal document, was the handwriting. Claire had overnighted several of Sam's old Union letters, their authenticity undisputed for comparison. "I've completed a full graphological analysis," Dr. Reed continued, and Claire could hear the rustle of papers over the line. The baseline, the letter spacing, the pen pressure, and several unique identifiers, specifically the loop on the capital, J, and the cross on the T, are a conclusive match. "There is no doubt, in my professional opinion, Ms. Miller, the note found in that capsule was written by your grandfather, Samuel Jones." The words hit Claire with the force of a verdict. It was done. The truth had a scientific seal of approval. The fight could now truly begin. Hanging up the phone, Claire felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She was no longer just a granddaughter seeking closure. She was now the custodian of a murder accusation, one certified by forensic science. The faded photograph of Sam on her laptop screen seemed to look at her with a new intensity, his youthful, determined gaze now feeling like a direct mandate. The fight was no longer just about clearing a name. It was about holding a murderer accountable. The weight of this realization was immense, a mixture of exhilaration and a deep, chilling fear. The Blackstone Mining Company was a billion-dollar corporation. They would not allow the ghost of one union man to tarnish their reputation or threaten their bottom line. She was about to walk into a war she was not sure she could win, armed with only a tiny scroll of paper and a 50-year-old story. With the forensic report saved to her hard drive, a digital confirmation of a historical crime, Claire's hands moved to the keyboard. Her fingers flew across the keys, typing 2 words into the search engine. Arthur Bishop. She braced herself for an obituary, an ancestry record, a trail that had gone cold decades ago. Instead, the top result was a link to a recent article in the West Virginia Gazette. The headline read, "Local philanthropist Arthur Bishop honored for a lifetime of community service." The accompanying photo showed a smiling, well-dressed elderly man with kind eyes, surrounded by local dignitaries. He was alive. He was 85 years old, living in a large house just 30 miles away, revered as a town father. The man her grandfather accused of leaving him to die in the dark was not a ghost. He was a celebrated local hero, and she was about to try and prove he was a monster. The image on the screen was a cruel paradox, a smiling, benevolent old man being lauded for his charity, his white hair and kind eyes a mask of public virtue. Claire stared at the digital photograph of Arthur Bishop, the philanthropist, and tried to reconcile it with the image of Arthur Bishop, the murderer, a man who would leave another to die in the suffocating darkness for profit. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. This wasn't some shadowy, long-dead villain from a history book. He was a living, breathing pillar of the community, insulated by a lifetime of good deeds and public adoration. Her grandfather's desperate, hastily scrawled note felt like a fragile whisper against the roar of this man's carefully constructed legacy. She realized with a sinking feeling that accusing him would not be seen as an act of justice, but as a vicious attack on a beloved local icon, an act of sacrilege against the town's own history. Switching off the laptop, Claire forced the emotional turmoil into a cold, methodical focus. An accusation backed by a 50-year-old note, even a forensically verified one, would be torn apart by Blackstone's lawyers and dismissed as the fantasy of a grieving relative. She needed more. She needed a human voice to corroborate the paper one. Her thoughts turned to the names her grandmother had mentioned in her diary, the men who formed Sam's inner circle, the ones who stood beside him on the picket line. She pulled out the old Union roster she had photographed at the library, her fingers tracing the faded typewritten names. Cross-referencing them with public records, she began to build a list of potential survivors, a roll call of ghosts. Each name was a potential key, a man who might have seen something, heard something, a man who might still be carrying the burden of the truth after 5 decades of silence. Her first call was to a number in Ohio, belonging to the son of a miner named Frank Peterson. The man who answered was guarded from the moment she introduced herself. When Claire mentioned the 1955 collapse and Samuel Jones, the line went utterly silent. She could hear the man's breathing, shallow and quick, a palpable wave of fear traveling through the phone line. "My father passed 10 years ago," he finally said, his voice clipped and cold, devoid of any emotion. "And he never spoke about the mine. Never. We have nothing to say to you." Before Claire could utter another word, the line went dead, the click of the receiver echoing the slam of a door in her face. It was her first direct contact with the wall of silence that had been built around that day, a wall mortared with fear and cemented by the passage of 50 long, intimidating years. Frustration coiled in her stomach. She paced the small motel room, the faded floral wallpaper seeming to close in on her. Her eyes landed on the rusted birdcage sitting on the dresser, a silent, skeletal witness in the corner. She picked it up, its cold, corroded metal, a stark contrast to the warmth of her own living hands. She ran a finger along the bent wires where the door hung open, a permanent gateway to a tomb. This small, fragile object was a perfect metaphor for the town itself, a cage of silence, where the truth, like the canary, had been sent down into the darkness to die, its warning unheard. The men who survived were like the cage, rusted and weakened by time, holding the memory of that sacrifice within them. She had to find a way to open the door, to let the story finally fly free. With renewed determination, Claire returned to her list, her pen striking through names one by one. Comedy deceased, moved, no forwarding address, family unreachable. The trail was colder than she could have imagined, a testament to the diaspora of mining families broken and scattered by the industry's slow decline. Hope was beginning to fade when her finger stopped on one name, Caleb Hayes. The union roster listed him as just 19 years old in 1955, one of the youngest men on Sam's crew. A quick search of local property records brought up a match. He was still here. He owned a small 2-acre plot of land on the outskirts of Black Creek, a place he had apparently never left. A surge of adrenaline shot through her. He was young enough then to remember everything clearly, and old enough now that perhaps, just perhaps, the fear had finally begun to outweigh the guilt of his silence. The drive to Caleb Hayes's house felt like a journey through time. The paved road gave way to gravel, winding past weather-beaten houses and the skeletal remains of old company stores. The air grew thicker, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. With every mile, Claire felt the grip of the present loosening, replaced by the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the past she was trying to excavate. She parked her rental car at the end of a long dirt driveway, her hands gripping the steering wheel. What would she say? How do you ask a man to exhume a 50-year-old murder he may have witnessed? Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the profound, unnerving silence of the surrounding woods. She was about to knock on the door of a man who had either been a coward or a victim, and she had no idea which one would greet her. The man who answered the door was a ghost of a different sort. Caleb Hayes was stooped and frail, his skin as wrinkled and translucent as old parchment. His eyes, pale blue and clouded with cataracts, held the deep, weary sorrow of a man who had seen too much. When Claire stated her name and said she was Samuel Jones's granddaughter, a tremor ran through his entire body. It wasn't just recognition, it was a deep, visceral shock, as if she had spoken the name of a specter he had spent his entire life trying to forget. I don't know anything," he stammered, his voice a dry, reedy rasp. He began to push the heavy wooden door closed. "That was a lifetime ago. Some things are better left buried. You should go." The finality in his tone was absolute. The door, a physical barrier to a past he was determined to keep locked away. As the gap in the doorway narrowed to a sliver, a desperate, unplanned instinct took over. Claire quickly reached into the canvas bag at her side and pulled out the rusted birdcage, holding it up in the space between them. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Caleb's eyes, which had been avoiding hers, snapped down to the object. All the color drained from his face, replaced by a ghastly, ashen pallor. His feigned ignorance, the protective shell he had worn for 5 decades, shattered into 1,000 pieces. His mouth fell open, and a choked, guttural sound escaped his throat. He stared at the cage, this relic of his greatest fear and his deepest shame, and the door in his trembling hand stopped moving. In that moment, Claire knew. He had been there. He had seen it. And she had found her witness. The silence that followed was heavy and fragile, stretched thin by 50 years of unspoken words. Caleb Hayes did not close the door. Instead, he slowly, almost painfully, opened it wider, his gaze fixed on the rusted birdcage in Claire's hands as if it were a holy relic or a venomous snake. He stepped back, a silent invitation into the dim, cluttered interior of his home, which smelled of old wood, dust, and regret. Claire entered, placing the cage on a small table, where it immediately became the room's center of gravity. Caleb sank into a worn armchair, his body collapsing as if the strings holding him upright had been snipped. The confession he had rehearsed in his mind for half a century, a silent litany of guilt, was finally about to be spoken aloud, and the weight of it seemed to crush the very air from the room. His voice, when it came, was a dry whisper, the sound of dust settling on a forgotten tomb. He described the morning of the strike, the electric tension, the hope and fear warring on the faces of the men. He remembered seeing Sam, resolute and calm, a beacon of strength. Then, his memory sharpened on a single, discordant detail. He saw Arthur Bishop not directing a crew or consulting a blueprint, but walking alone, with a grim, purposeful stride, towards Gallery 7, the oldest, most unstable section of the mine, where Sam was doing a final safety check. Bishop was carrying a heavy canvas satchel, a detail that struck Caleb as odd. Foremen rarely carried their own tools, especially not into a section scheduled for minimal work. It was a fleeting image, a piece of a puzzle he didn't yet understand, but one that would replay in his mind for the next 50 years with horrifying clarity. Then came the explosion. Caleb described it not as a sound, but as a physical concussion, a brutal punch from the earth itself that threw him and other miners off their feet. It was deeper, more violent, and more final than any controlled blast they had ever experienced. The air filled with a thick, choking cloud of rock dust that tasted of death. In the ensuing chaos, it was Arthur Bishop's voice that cut through the panic, ordering everyone back, declaring the gallery a total loss, too unstable for any rescue attempt. His efficiency was chilling, his declaration too quick, too certain. He sealed Sam's tomb with words long before the company would seal it with concrete, and Caleb, watching him, felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the unstable rock and everything to do with the foreman's unshakable, almost rehearsed composure. The true weight of the conspiracy, however, settled on him a few days later. The strike had crumbled without its leader, the men drifting back to work, defeated and demoralized. Caleb recalled being part of a small group sweeping rock dust near the foreman's office. When Bishop approached them, the foreman's face was a mask of cold authority, his eyes devoid of any sympathy. He spoke in a low, even tone that was more terrifying than any shout. Samuel Jones was a fool who got himself killed, Bishop had said, his gaze lingering on each of them. A man with a family to feed learns to keep his mouth shut about things that don't concern him. Curiosity can be a costly thing in a town like this. It wasn't advice. It was a threat, a clear and unmistakable message that silence was the price of survival in Black Creek. Caleb's story was a torrent of pent-up guilt, his words punctuated by ragged, difficult breaths. He looked at Claire, his pale eyes swimming with tears that had been held back for 5 decades. The weight of his cowardice was a physical presence in the room, a ghost that had haunted every day of his life. Seeing him go into that gallery alone, knowing what he was planning. That was watching a murder. Caleb choked out, his voice cracking under the strain. He leaned forward, his hands trembling violently as he gripped the arms of his chair. But what I overheard a few days after that, coming from inside his office, that was something else entirely. That was much, much worse. The words hung in the air, a new layer of darkness settling over the already horrific tale, promising a truth more sinister than a simple act of sabotage. Claire held her breath, her journalistic instincts battling the wave of nausea that rose in her throat. "What did you hear, Caleb?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He explained that he had been sent to clean the windows of the main office building, a menial task for the youngest miners. He was outside Bishop's office when he heard the foreman's voice, low and congratulatory, and another, smoother voice he didn't recognize. A man from the corporate office in Charleston. He heard the stranger say, "The board is very pleased with how you handled the union situation. Consider it a necessary expense to ensure long-term stability." Then he heard Bishop reply, "The 5,000 will set my family up right. Jones won't be a problem for anyone ever again." The pieces clicked into place with sickening precision. It wasn't just murder. It was a contract killing, sanctioned and paid for by the company. The entire foundation of Claire's investigation shifted. This was no longer the story of a jealous foreman eliminating a rival. This was a corporate conspiracy, a cold-blooded assassination plotted in a boardroom and executed in the dark tunnels of the widow's shaft to protect profits and break the will of the working class. Her grandfather hadn't just been betrayed by one man, he had been executed by a system. The enemy was not just the ghost of Arthur Bishop, the retired philanthropist, but the living, breathing entity of Blackstone Mining, a billion-dollar corporation with a history of burying its sins under mountains of rock and legal paperwork. The stakes had just been raised exponentially. She was no longer just fighting for a name, she was fighting a giant that had crushed her family and an entire town under its heel. Caleb's confession was a bombshell, but Claire knew that in a court of law, or in the court of public opinion, it was still just the word of one elderly, frightened man against a corporate titan. She needed proof of the payoff. The phrase, "the 5,000," echoed in her mind. It was a tangible lead, a breadcrumb that might still exist in some dusty, forgotten archive. Her investigation pivoted from collecting human memories to hunting for a single piece of paper. She spent the next 3 days in the county records office, poring over Blackstone's financial ledgers from 1955, her eyes burning from the strain of deciphering faded ink on brittle, yellowed pages. She was searching for a single entry, a financial anomaly that would corroborate Caleb's story and turn his testimony into an undeniable indictment. Her persistent digging did not go unnoticed. On the 4th day, as she was leaving the archives, a courier delivered a crisp, white envelope to her motel room. Inside was a letter, thick and embossed with the logo of a prestigious Charleston law firm. It was a formal cease and desist order from the legal department of Blackstone Mining. In cold, precise legal language, it accused her of, quote, "a campaign of harassment and defamation against a respected former employee," and the malicious spreading of unfounded, 50-year-old rumors. It warned that if she continued her inquiries, the company would seek immediate legal action, including a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for damages to its corporate reputation. The letter was a declaration of war, a clear signal that she had struck a nerve and that the giant was beginning to stir. The threat was a physical weight, pressing down on her. She sat on the edge of her motel bed, the lawyer's letter trembling in her hand. They were trying to crush her, to bury her investigation with the same ruthless efficiency they had used to bury her grandfather. For a moment, a wave of profound fear washed over her. She was alone, a freelance journalist with dwindling funds, against an enemy with seemingly limitless resources. They could bankrupt her, ruin her career, and ensure this story never saw the light of day. The weight of her promise to her grandmother, the haunted look in Caleb's eyes, the silent accusation of the rusted birdcage, it all felt impossibly heavy. The fight suddenly seemed not just difficult, but unwinnable, a foolish crusade against an unmovable mountain. But as the initial shock subsided, it was replaced by a cold, burning anger. The letter was not just a legal threat, it was a confession. An innocent company, confident in its history, would have dismissed her as a crank. They would not have deployed their most expensive lawyers to silence a single journalist digging through 50-year-old paperwork. Their aggression was proof of their guilt. They were afraid of what she might find. She stood up and walked over to the dresser, picking up the photograph of Sam Jones. His eyes, full of conviction and defiance, seemed to look right through her. He had faced down this same corporate machine with nothing but his voice and his courage. She would not, could not, let them win now. The lawsuit wasn't an obstacle. It was confirmation. She was close, and they knew it. The legal document in Claire's hand was not a shield for the company. It was a sword, and they had just handed it to her. The carefully worded threats, the invocation of corporate reputation, the attempt to financially intimidate her into silence, it was the desperate act of a guilty party. She knew a legal battle would be a war of attrition she couldn't win, a quagmire of motions and depositions designed to bankrupt her spirit and her savings. But her battlefield was not the courtroom, it was the front page. Blackstone Mining had built a 50-year-old wall of silence around Black Creek, and she was about to demolish it with the one weapon they couldn't control, the truth. Her fear from moments before had transmuted into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. They wanted a fight? She would give them one that played out in the light for the entire world to see. Her first call was to Ben Carter, a grizzled investigative journalist at the New York Standard, with whom she'd worked years ago. He was a man who smelled corporate malfeasance like a shark smells blood in the water. In a hushed, urgent tone, Claire laid out the entire story, a narrative so incredible it sounded like fiction. She told him about the mine, the rusted birdcage that now sat on her motel dresser like a shrine, the forensically verified note from her dead grandfather, and the terrified, tearful confession of an old man whose name she would protect for now. She finished by reading him the key phrases from the cease and desist letter. "They're trying to bury it again, Ben," she said, her voice low and intense. "But this time, the whole world is going to be watching them dig the hole." Initially, Ben was guarded, his journalist skepticism a well-honed defense against crackpots and conspiracy theorists. But as Claire methodically detailed the scientific certainty of Dr. Reed's forensic report, his tone shifted from cautious to captivated. A 50-year-old cold case was one thing. A corporate-sanctioned assassination of a union leader with verifiable proof was the kind of story that wins Pulitzers and topples empires. He agreed to help, promising the resources of the paper to start digging into Blackstone's past from his end. "You stay on the ground and focus on the foreman," he instructed, his voice now a conspiratorial whisper. "I'll start pulling on the threads from the boardroom. Let's see which one unravels their whole sweater first." The investigation had officially opened a second front, transforming her personal quest into a coordinated assault. Claire's focus narrowed with surgical precision on the single most tangible lead, the $5,000 payment Caleb had overheard. She knew a direct transaction would be too obvious, even in 1955. It wouldn't be in a public ledger. It would be hidden, disguised, moved through channels that left the faintest of trails. She began a painstaking, laborious search through archived microfilms of local bank records and county property deeds, a process that felt like searching for a single grain of sand on an endless beach. She wasn't just looking for a payment to Arthur Bishop. She was looking for any large, unexplained financial event in his life in the weeks and months following the mine collapse. She was hunting for the ripple effect of a secret, life-changing infusion of cash, a sudden purchase or a paid-off debt that would betray the source of its funding. Her relentless presence in the town's public records did not go unnoticed. 2 nights later, she returned to her motel after a 14-hour day at the county courthouse to find the door slightly ajar. A cold dread washed over her as she pushed it open. The room had been expertly, almost sterilely, searched. Her suitcase was open, its contents neatly disturbed. The papers on her desk were subtly rearranged, but the target of the search was clear. Her research notes and the photocopies of Eleanor's diary pages were gone. They had left her laptop and the birdcage, a calculated decision to make it look like a minor theft, while delivering a powerful, silent message. This was no longer a war of words or legal threats. Blackstone Mining had just crossed a line, bringing the conflict out of the archives and into her personal space. The intimidation was now physical. The violation, meant to paralyze her with fear, instead ignited a fresh wave of fury. They had confirmed their desperation. They were afraid of what she was finding, and they were afraid of her grandmother's words, written half a century ago. She immediately called Caleb Hayes, her voice tight with a protective urgency. "They know I'm getting close," she warned him. "They searched my room. You need to be careful. Don't talk to anyone you don't know." She heard a long, shaky breath on the other end of the line. The old man's fear was a palpable thing, a fragile shield against a lifetime of intimidation. "I've been scared for 50 years, little lady," he finally rasped, a new steel in his voice. "I'm not going back into that hole. Not now." In that moment, their alliance was forged in shared risk. The fight was no longer just for Sam's memory. It was for Caleb's soul. The next afternoon, a call from Ben Carter blew the conspiracy wide open. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his voice crackling with the excitement of a major discovery. In 1956, the U.S. Department of Labor launched a covert investigation into Blackstone Mining for illegal union-busting activities. It was a serious inquiry, with federal agents on the ground. Then, 6 months in, it just vanished. The case was dropped, files sealed, no reason given. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. "Who ran the investigation?" she asked. Ben gave a short, bitter laugh. "A guy named Robert Patterson. 2 years later, he resigned from his government post to accept a highly paid executive position as the head of corporate security for Blackstone. They didn't just silence a foreman, Claire. They bought a federal agent. The web of corruption was larger and more intricate than she had ever imagined. Ben's research had also unearthed the name of the man who ran Blackstone's operations in 1955, the executive who would have authorized the payment to Bishop Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a ruthless figure, known in corporate circles for his aggressive, no-holds-barred approach to labor disputes. He had died in the 1980s, but his legacy was very much alive. The powerful East Coast investment firm he founded, Thorne Capital, was now run by his grandson. And a deep dive into their portfolio revealed a stunning modern-day connection. Thorne Capital was a major shareholder in the parent company that owned the current Blackstone Mining Corporation. The crime wasn't just a historical footnote. Its profits were still generating wealth for the descendants of the man who likely ordered it. This new knowledge gave Claire the missing piece she needed. She returned to the county courthouse, her search now laser-focused. She ignored Blackstone's records and went straight to the property deeds index for 1955, searching under Arthur Bishop's name. And there it was. On October 19, 1955, exactly 1 week after her grandfather was left to die in Gallery 7, Arthur Bishop had purchased a sprawling 200-acre parcel of farmland bordering the river. It was a prime piece of real estate that would become the foundation of his family's local influence. The official purchase price, clearly listed in the deed of sale and filed with the county clerk, was $5,000. The payment was recorded as a single, untraceable transaction, cash. It was the smoking gun, a clean, undeniable line connecting the whispered payoff to a life-altering purchase. The faded ink on the 50-year-old property deed was more than just a record. It was a confession written in the language of money. The productivity bonus was a lie. The revered philanthropist's fortune was not built on hard work or shrewd investments. It was founded on blood money, the price paid for a man's life. Every charitable donation he had ever made, every plaque that bore his name, every word of praise from the community was a monument built upon the tomb of Samuel Jones. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in Claire's mind, forming a picture of such cold, calculated evil that it took her breath away. The note in the cage, Caleb's testimony, the corporate cover-up, and now the financial proof. It was a complete, unbroken chain of evidence stretching across 5 decades of lies. Her hands trembling with a mixture of vindication and revulsion, Claire stepped out of the dusty courthouse and into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. She pulled out her phone and dialed Ben Carter's number, her heart hammering against her ribs. When he answered, her voice was steady, imbued with a chilling certainty. "I have it, Ben," she said, the words feeling momentous on her tongue. "I have the money. I can prove Bishop bought a massive piece of land with cash 1 week after the collapse. For exactly $5,000. A profound silence hung on the line before Ben finally spoke. "It's done then," he said softly. "You have the whole damn story." She now held every piece of the truth, a weapon powerful enough to rewrite history. The only question that remained was how to deploy it before the giant she had cornered decided to crush her for good. The drive to Arthur Bishop's house was a pilgrimage into enemy territory. With the land deed, a 50-year-old receipt for a man's life, secured in her bag, Claire felt a profound shift in her mission. This was no longer just about publishing a story for the world. It was about confronting the ghost that had haunted her family for 2 generations. She needed to stand in the same room as the man who had left her grandfather to die in the dark. She needed to look into his eyes and see for herself what kind of person could build a life of prosperity and respect upon a foundation of such profound evil. The truth felt incomplete without this final, personal reckoning. It was a confrontation not just for Sam, but for Eleanor, for Caleb, and for the part of herself that had been defined by a question mark her entire life. This final step was for her. The house sat at the end of a long, tree-lined driveway, a stately brick home that exuded an aura of old money and quiet dignity. It was the physical embodiment of the lie Bishop had lived, its manicured lawns and pristine white columns, a stark, cruel contrast to the chaotic, dusty tomb where Sam Jones had drawn his last breath. Claire parked her car and walked towards the heavy oak door, the gravel crunching under her feet with an unnatural loudness in the afternoon stillness. She could feel the weight of the 200 acres surrounding her, the very land her grandfather's death had purchased. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and blooming roses, a scent of placid suburbia that felt like a desecration. Every window seemed like an eye, watching her, guarding the dark secret held within its walls. A woman in a crisp nurse's uniform answered the door, her expression professionally placid. Claire introduced herself as a journalist working on a historical piece about the Black Creek mining community, a carefully constructed half-truth. She asked if she might have a few moments of Mr. Bishop's time to discuss his role as a longtime community leader. The nurse hesitated, then nodded, leading Claire through a pristine foyer where polished wood floors gleamed under a crystal chandelier. The walls were adorned with framed photographs of a smiling family, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, a dynasty, built on a single violent act of betrayal. The silence of the house was deep and unnerving, the kind of quiet that feels earned by wealth and insulated from the messy realities of the world outside. It was the silence of a successful cover-up. She found Arthur Bishop in a glass-walled sunroom overlooking a sprawling garden. He was seated in a leather wingback chair, a plaid blanket draped over his thin legs, a book lying open in his lap. He looked exactly like his photograph, frail, with wisps of white hair and eyes that, despite his age, were sharp and unnervingly intelligent. He offered a weak but polite smile as Claire approached, the very picture of a benevolent patriarch enjoying his final years. When she introduced herself fully using her name, Claire Miller, Samuel Jones's granddaughter, the smile did not falter, but a subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred behind his eyes. There was a flicker of something ancient and cold, a brief glimpse of the man he had been in 1955, before the mask of benign old age settled back into place. Claire didn't wait for his denial. She sat opposite him and, with a steady hand, pulled the forensic report from her bag, placing it on the small table between them. "Engineers found this 2 weeks ago, Mr. Bishop," she began, her voice even and devoid of emotion. "In a sealed-off passage in Gallery 7. She then took out a photograph of the note itself and read her grandfather's last words into the quiet, sun-drenched room. "Bishop sabotaged the supports. He left me trapped. Asterisk." The words, spoken aloud after 50 years of silence, seemed to suck the warmth from the air. Bishop's face remained a carefully composed mask of confusion and offense. "My dear," he said, his voice a reedy whisper, "that was a terrible tragedy, but this is a cruel fantasy, a forgery designed to hurt an old man." "Then let's talk about a memory, not a fantasy," Claire pressed on, her gaze unwavering. "Let's talk about a young miner who saw you that morning. He saw you walk into Gallery 7, alone, carrying a heavy canvas satchel. He heard the explosion, an explosion much bigger than any scheduled blast. And he remembers you ordering everyone back, declaring it a lost cause before anyone even had a chance to look." Bishop's hands, which had been resting peacefully on his book, clenched into tight, bloodless fists. "The ramblings of some senile old fool," he spat, the polite facade beginning to crack, revealing the venom beneath. "People see what they want to see. They invent stories to make sense of tragedies they can't accept. Your grandfather was a reckless man who got himself killed." With deliberate slowness, Claire reached back into her bag. This was the final piece, the key that unlocked everything. She slid a clear, plastic-sheathed copy of the property deed across the table. Her finger tapped on the date. "October 19th, 1955, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet each word landing with the force of a hammer blow. "1 week after my grandfather died, you purchased 200 acres of prime riverfront property, the foundation of your entire family's fortune." She paused, letting the silence stretch before delivering the final, irrefutable blow. The purchase price, filed with the county clerk, was $5,000, paid in cash. The specificity of the number, the tangible proof of the transaction, was a weapon that his denials could not deflect. It was the truth, written in ink and filed for 50 years. The color drained from Arthur Bishop's face, the mask of the philanthropist, the community leader, the benevolent grandfather, shattered into a million pieces. In its place was the face of a cornered animal, his sharp eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape that no longer existed. The carefully constructed world he had built over 5 decades crumbled in the space of a single heartbeat. The sunroom, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a cage. A long, suffocating silence descended, broken only by the frantic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, each tick marking a second of a life built on a lie. He stared at the deed, at the undeniable proof of his sin, and the frail old man vanished completely, replaced by the cold, ruthless foreman from 1955. When he finally spoke, his voice was transformed. The reedy weakness was gone, replaced by a low, gravelly tone laced with a chilling authority, the same voice Caleb had described hearing 50 years ago. "He was a fool," Bishop said, his gaze lifting to meet Claire's, his eyes burning with a cold, unrepentant fire. "A sentimental fool with a silver tongue. He was going to bring this whole town to its knees for nothing but a principle. He spoke of dignity, while men with families to feed were about to starve because of his strike. There was no remorse in his voice, only a profound, chilling conviction. He was not confessing to a crime. He was justifying a necessary, if unpleasant, act of business. He was defending the brutal logic that had guided his entire life. The confession, once started, flowed from him like poison from a ruptured vessel. He spoke of it with a detached, procedural coldness, as if describing a routine mining operation. He detailed how he had sawed partway through a critical support beam in Gallery 7 the night before, a hidden weakness that would guarantee a total collapse. He described overpacking the explosive charge, just enough to ensure the blast would be catastrophic. The company needed stability, he stated, his eyes distant, lost in the memory of the dark tunnel. They needed the problem removed. I was the one who had the courage to do what was necessary. I saved this town from his idealism. That $5,000 wasn't a payoff. It was a reward for protecting the company's assets and the town's future. Claire felt a profound, icy coldness seep into her bones, a horror far deeper than she had prepared for. She was not listening to a man haunted by guilt. She was listening to a monster who believed he was a hero, a man whose conscience had been surgically removed decades ago. "And the canary?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "The note my grandfather tied to its leg? Did you ever wonder what he wrote in his final moments?" A cruel, thin smile touched Bishop's lips, a final twist of the knife. "A birdcage," he scoffed, a dry, rattling laugh escaping his throat. "He was always a poet, your grandfather, wasting his last breath on a message in a bottle. He died for nothing. His fight, his precious union, it all died with him in that hole." The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of that final statement struck Claire with the force of a physical blow. Bishop's intent was clear: to extinguish the last flicker of her grandfather's legacy, to render his final act of defiance meaningless. But in his arrogance, he had misjudged her completely. She did not break. Instead, a calm, glacial resolve settled over her. She slowly stood up, her movements precise and deliberate. She looked down at the unrepentant man who had stolen her family's past and tried to poison its future. With a steady hand, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, digital voice recorder, its red light blinking, a silent, crimson witness to the entire conversation. She pressed the stop button. The soft click of the device echoed in the silent sunroom, a sound as definitive and final as a cell door slamming shut. Bishop's eyes widened in stunned comprehension, the cold confidence in his face finally replaced by the first flicker of genuine fear. He had been so consumed by his own self-righteous narrative that he had never considered he was not just speaking to a grieving granddaughter, but delivering his own eulogy to a journalist. "No, Mr. Bishop?" Claire said, her voice ringing with the clear, cold finality of a verdict. "His fight didn't die with him." She looked directly into the eyes of the man who had built a life on silence and darkness. "It's just getting started." The digital recorder felt like a lead weight in Claire Miller's pocket as she walked away from Arthur Bishop's pristine, soulless house. The sunlit world outside seemed alien, its colors too bright, its sounds too cheerful for the chilling darkness she had just confronted. Her first action was mechanical, instinctual. She got into her car, locked the doors, and with a hand that trembled only slightly, she dialed Ben Carter. Her voice was a low, steady hum, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. "I have it, Ben," she said, the words tasting of victory and ash. "I have it all. A full confession, on tape. He's proud of it." A profound silence met her from the other end of the line, the sound of a journalist recognizing the story of a lifetime. The race against Blackstone's inevitable, brutal retaliation had just begun. The story broke the next morning, detonating across the digital landscape with the force of a long-buried explosive. The New York Standard's headline was stark and damning. A 50YEAR lie audio confession implicates mining giant Indiana 1955 murder of union leader. Ben Carter's article was a masterclass in narrative journalism, seamlessly weaving together the forensic certainty of Dr. Reed's report, the heartbreaking testimony of a protected Caleb Hayes, the irrefutable proof of the $5,000 land deed, and the centerpiece, transcribed excerpts of Arthur Bishop's cold, unrepentant confession. The story didn't just report the facts. It resurrected a ghost and gave him a voice that echoed with 50 years of silenced truth, sparking a firestorm of national outrage that could not be contained. For Blackstone Mining, the fallout was catastrophic. Their initial corporate statement, a bland dismissal of unfounded allegations from a bygone era, was released just minutes before the audio clips of Bishop's confession were embedded in the online article, making them look not only guilty, but comically inept. Their stock value plummeted in pre-market trading as investors panicked. The carefully polished image of corporate responsibility, built over decades with millions of dollars in public relations, was incinerated in a single news cycle. The cease and desist letter, once their primary weapon, was now Exhibit A in the story of their cover-up, a monument to the corporate arrogance that had finally led to their downfall. Public outcry, fueled by the story's viral spread across social media and cable news, descended upon the West Virginia District Attorney's Office with the force of a hurricane. Within hours, facing immense political and public pressure, the DA announced the immediate reopening of the 1955 case of Samuel Jones, citing the emergence of new, undeniable, and deeply disturbing evidence. Legal experts on every network confirmed that the statute of limitations for murder did not apply. By mid-afternoon, the theoretical had become terrifyingly real as state police cruisers, their lights silently flashing, turned down the long, tree-lined driveway leading to the stately brick home of the town's most revered philanthropist. The image that followed became iconic, a symbol of justice delayed but not denied. A frail and disoriented Arthur Bishop, his face a mask of disbelief, was led out of his sun-drenched sanctuary in handcuffs. The plaid blanket he had hidden behind was gone, replaced by the cold, hard steel of justice. Photographers captured the moment his kind, philanthropic eyes, the ones that had charmed a town for 50 years, met the unblinking lens of the camera, revealing for the first time a flicker of pure, unadulterated fear. The town of Black Creek, and indeed the entire nation, watched in stunned silence as the man they thought they knew was unmasked, his legacy of charity revealed as a grotesque costume worn to hide the monster beneath. Claire drove to Caleb Hayes's small, secluded house, finding him on his front porch, the morning newspaper spread across his lap. His shoulders shook with silent, convulsive sobs. He looked up as she approached, his pale eyes, for the first time since she'd met him, clear of the haunted shadow that had lived there for 5 decades. "They hurt him," Caleb whispered, his voice thick with a relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. After all this time, they finally heard Sam. For Caleb, the resolution wasn't about vengeance against Bishop. It was about the emancipation of a truth he had been forced to carry as a prisoner in his own mind. His silence had been a life sentence of guilt, and with the story now told, he was finally granted a pardon. Her final, most important visit was to the quiet, antiseptic room in the nursing home. She sat beside her grandmother, Eleanor, whose life had been defined by a question that now had a definitive, brutal answer. Claire didn't play the entire recording. Instead, she played only the parts that mattered. Bishop's admission, his motive, the confirmation that Sam had not abandoned his men but had been murdered for defending them. Eleanor listened, with her eyes closed, her breathing steady. When the audio ended, she didn't speak for a long time. Then, she opened her eyes, and they were filled not with fresh grief, but with a deep, ancient peace. "I knew," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. "I always knew I married a hero. It was the validation of a 50-year faith, the final, quiet chord in a love story brutally interrupted by history." The town of Black Creek was plunged into a painful but necessary identity crisis. The name Bishop, once synonymous with charity and progress, was now a curse, a brand of Cain. Families who had accepted his donations and praised his civic leadership were forced into a moral reckoning, questioning the very foundations upon which their community's modern history was built. The comfortable, sanitized version of the past was shattered, replaced by a more complex and tragic narrative of fear, complicity, and corporate subjugation. The story of Sam Jones forced the town to look into the mirror and confront the reflection of a community that had, for 50 years, chosen the comfort of a prosperous lie over the hardship of a devastating truth. The legal repercussions for Blackstone Mining were swift and severe. Bishop's confession, which explicitly mentioned the company's directive to remove the problem, opened the floodgates. Dozens of class action lawsuits were filed by the descendants of other miners who had died in the widow's shaft under suspicious circumstances. The scandal triggered federal investigations, leading to massive fines and forcing a complete restructuring of the board of directors. In a public act of atonement, the company established a multi-million-dollar compensation fund for the families of the Black Creek miners, a corporate surrender that Sam Jones, 50 years earlier, could have only dreamed of achieving. His death, in the end, accomplished what his life's fight had begun. Arthur Bishop never faced a jury. Declared too frail for a jail cell, he was placed under house arrest, his stately home transformed into a comfortable prison. He remained defiant to the end, refusing to speak to the media or offer any apology, cloaked in a chilling, unrepentant silence. 3 months after his arrest, before a trial date could be set, he died of a massive coronary event in his leather wingback chair. Some called it a final escape from justice, but Claire knew better. Justice had not been about locking up an old man's body. It had been about liberating her grandfather's truth. Bishop's name was now eternally synonymous with murder and betrayal, his legacy destroyed, a fate for a man so obsessed with his public image, far worse than any prison sentence. The rusted birdcage, the fragile vessel that had carried the truth across a half-century of darkness, was given a place of honor. It was acquired by the West Virginia State Museum and became the centerpiece of a new permanent exhibit on the state's tumultuous labor history. Encased in protective glass, the tiny skeleton of the canary and a replica of the metal capsule became a pilgrimage site for Union members and historians. The object that had once symbolized a final, unheard warning was transformed into a powerful icon of enduring defiance, a testament to the fact that even the smallest voice, if it carries the weight of truth, can eventually bring down a mountain. A year later, Claire returned to Black Creek for a dedication ceremony. The oppressive silence she first encountered was gone, replaced by a new sense of communal identity forged in the painful crucible of historical truth. In the town square, a new bronze plaque had been mounted, gleaming in the Appalachian sun. It read, "In memory of Samuel Jones. A life taken in the darkness for fighting for the light. His courage, though buried, was never lost." The town had finally, officially, chosen its hero. They were no longer a community defined by a company's power, but by the resilience of a man who dared to challenge it. A man whose legacy they were now proud to claim as their own. Standing before the memorial, Claire felt the final, heavy link to the past gently fall away. She had fulfilled her promise to her grandmother, who had passed away peacefully in her sleep just 2 months after learning the truth, her long vigil finally over. She had given Caleb Hayes peace, and she had given her grandfather back his name and his honor. The fight that Sam had written about in his final, desperate note, "The fight must go on," had been passed through time to her. She had picked up his fallen torch and carried it to the finish line. Touching the cold, raised letters of his name, she felt a profound sense of closure, not of an ending, but of a story finally being told right, its last chapter written not in anger, but in justice. The story of Black Creek was no longer a simple linear narrative of industry and hardship, but a complex tapestry woven with threads of courage, betrayal, and, ultimately, redemption. The bronze plaque in the town square was more than a memorial. It was a tombstone for a 50-year-old lie. It marked the definitive end of an era where history was a commodity, owned and manipulated by the Blackstone Mining Company. Now, the town's story belonged to its people, reclaimed by the granddaughter of the man they had been taught to forget. The unveiling ceremony was not a somber affair, but a quiet celebration of resilience, a testament to the fact that a community's soul, no matter how deeply buried under the weight of corporate power, could eventually be excavated and restored to the light, scarred but whole. The entire saga served as a powerful, chilling reminder of the fragility of truth and its paradoxical strength. For half a century, a truth powerful enough to dismantle a corporate empire and rewrite history was contained within a space no larger than a man's fingertip. It was protected not by steel vaults or armed guards, but by the delicate, skeletal remains of a canary, itself a symbol of sacrifice. The rusted birdcage, the brittle paper, the faded ink. These were the humble, almost insignificant vessels of a monumental justice. It proved that the most enduring truths are often not the loudest, but the most patient, waiting silently in the dark for a single flicker of light, ready to burn down the fortress of lies built to contain them. In the end, the legacies of the two men, Samuel Jones and Arthur Bishop, underwent a total and permanent inversion. Bishop, the celebrated philanthropist whose name adorned libraries and hospital wings, was now an eternal footnote of treachery, his fortune forever tainted by the blood money it was built upon. His stately home became a local monument to his disgrace. Conversely, Samuel Jones, the ghost who haunted the town's periphery, the man dismissed as a fool or a coward, was finally enshrined as its moral center. His name, once spoken in hushed, uncertain tones, was now a symbol of unwavering integrity and ultimate sacrifice. History, the final and most impartial judge, had finally corrected its records, ensuring that the villain was unmasked and the true hero was given his rightful place in the sun. The ripples of the Black Creek investigation spread far beyond the Appalachian Valley. The national exposure of the case, with its dramatic elements of a message from the grave and a corporate conspiracy, emboldened other communities that had long suffered under the heel of industrial giants. It sparked a new wave of historical inquiry, with families in old steel towns and forgotten factory districts beginning to question the official narratives of their own local tragedies. Sam Jones's fight, which he feared had died with him in the suffocating darkness of Gallery 7, was resurrected 1,000 times over. His solitary act of defiance became a catalyst, igniting countless smaller battles for truth across the country, proving that one man's courage, even posthumously, could become the blueprint for a generation's quest for justice. The Canary's cage, now housed behind climate-controlled glass at the State Museum, became an object of secular pilgrimage. It drew crowds who stood in silent contemplation, staring at the tiny, fragile artifact that had brought a corporate Goliath to its knees. It was a potent symbol, a physical manifestation of the idea that the grand, sweeping narratives of history are often turned by the smallest of hinges. The cage taught a profound lesson, that the truth is not always found in the official archives or the pronouncements of powerful men, but in the forgotten relics of ordinary lives, a faded diary entry, a whispered memory, or a desperate final message tied to the leg of a bird sent to die in the dark. It became a monument to the quiet, persistent power of the voiceless. For Claire Miller, the journey had been a crucible that forged a new purpose in her life. She was no longer content to be a passive chronicler of the past. She had become an active agent of historical justice. The resolution of her grandfather's case was not an ending but a beginning. She established a non-profit organization, the Canary Project, dedicated to investigating historical injustices and giving a voice to families whose truths had been systematically buried by time and power. She had inherited her grandfather's fight, transforming his battle for a union into a broader war for memory itself. Her life's work was now to ensure that no other story, no other hero, would be left forgotten in the cold, silent darkness of a sealed-off mine. This story serves as a powerful reminder that every town, every family, and every institution has its own buried truths, its own widow's shafts, full of silent stories waiting for someone brave enough to bring them into the light. The tale of Samuel Jones is just one of countless histories that have been deliberately forgotten. And that was just the beginning of something much bigger. If this story has moved you, please help us continue this fight for the truth by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell. Tell us in the comments if you know of a forgotten story in your own community that deserves to be told. We are committed to unearthing these histories one story at a time, but we can only do it with your support. The final words her grandfather wrote, "The fight must go on," now resonated with a meaning far deeper than a simple labor dispute. Claire finally understood that it was a timeless and universal mandate, a sacred responsibility passed from one generation to the next. It was the fight for memory against forced amnesia, for the individual against the faceless institution, for the enduring power of truth against the temporary reign of silence. The fight is never truly won, because the forces that seek to bury uncomfortable truths are relentless. It is a perpetual relay, a torch of inquiry and courage that must be passed on, ensuring that the darkness never gets the final word, and that every voice, no matter how long it has been silenced, is eventually heard. Standing in the quiet cemetery of Black Creek, Claire placed a hand on the cool granite of a newly carved headstone that finally bore her grandfather's name. The oppressive silence she had first felt in this town was gone, replaced by a profound and cleansing peace. The mountain no longer felt like a tomb guarding a dark secret, but simply a mountain, its power over the town's psyche finally broken. For 50 years, a community had lived in the shadow of a lie, its history held captive by a single act of violence. But in the end, it was not dynamite or machinery that moved the mountain. It was the unwavering persistence of a single, fragile truth, carried through time by a love that refused to let it die.